Let's find out what the best Game Boy Advance is in this video. What is up, guys? Welcome back to another video. And I know it's been a little while, but I'm gonna try to get back into making videos. And in today's video, which I could probably tell by the intro, we're gonna be finding out what is the best Game Boy Advance for, in case if you or any of your friends would want to collect them, or even just play them for a little bit. But the ones that we are deciding between are the original Game Boy Advance from 2001, the Game Boy Advance SP from 2003, and the Game Boy Micro from 2005. So, let's get right into deciding. So, okay. Basically, there are three different versions of the Game Boy Advance. One of them being the Game Boy Advance Original, which was in 2001. Now, after Nintendo's created this whole library of games for their Game Boy, and they're slowly going up in sales after the Game Boy Color's release, they needed something after 3 years of the Game Boy Color being released. So, they were thinking, let's bring actual console graphics to a handheld. So they went ahead and they got the Game Boy Advance. Now, this was amazing. It was one of the most comfortable Game Boys to ever hold, with the horizontal kind of shape, the shoulder buttons being the perfect size, and everything. Also, it was really portable too, and it only took 2 AA batteries to use, the same as the Game Boy Color, so it wouldn't be too much of a hassle to buy more batteries than you would need for the Color. But the only difference is, not only did the Game Boy Advance play original Game Boy games and Game Boy Color games, but it had its own kind of games called GBA games, or Game Boy Advance games. As you can see, it's about half the size of a regular Game Boy cartridge, as you can see. And they were way more powerful. Even though they were smaller than an original Game Boy's cartridge, they had better graphics. They had way more key details inside of the graphics. And it was really, really fast compared to a Game Boy game. Most Game Boy games were slow, kind of RPGs, or trying to like be something like Mario, for example, like a kind of platformer game that's not going to take up too much data. So, these ones were kind of a bit faster paced and a lot more graphic details in it. Also, the starting screen is different. For a original Game Boy, the startup was this, as you can see, but with the volume up, it was like this. For the Game Boy Advance, however, the startup was now this. It was a bit different than the Game Boy one. It was a bit more kind of interactive and a bit more creative than just a bing and the Game Boy logo. So people were kind of surprised by that, on top of all the other stuff that they had to realize. But the only thing that was setting the Game Boy Advance original back from being everybody's favorite was the screen. After every other thing, after the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Pocket, everything, they were thinking, oh, it's advanced, the screen's going to be lit up, that's why it's called the Advance. No. The only thing that was making it the Advanced Game Boy was the different games, and also the 2 shoulder buttons that were now added at the top to help with games, or change the size of the screen for original Game Boy games that you played. That was the only difference. So, everybody was kind of thinking, okay, but there's new games, so I'll still have fun, which is true. And you could also still buy a adapter for a light that goes over it, called the worm light. So people were still thinking they could use that and have fun, so they did that for a while. until what is called the most favorited Game Boy, the Game Boy Advance SP released. I got this about a year ago, and I love this thing until I got the other Game Boy. But I love this thing a lot because you can play Game Boy games as well. You can still play Game Boy games and Game Boy Color games, as you can see. But on top of the fact that you can still play the Game Boy Advance games. Now, the only differences between these two systems is that this one is completely different. That's the thing. This is what everybody originally thought of whenever they thought of the advanced Game Boy. They thought of more portable. They thought of an actual lit screen like this, as you can see. Because this one right here, as you can see, is a lit screen. Normally, it's not lit at all. And as y'all saw with the other one, let me put them side by side. If I can do this with one hand. Here's this one. And here's the Advance, as y'all can see. And then if I were to turn them on, then you will see the difference. That's what the original one looks like. This is what the SP looks like. So y'all can see a clear difference in the screen brightness. And also the thing about the Advance, if it was too bright outside to use the light, then there was a thing where you could turn off the light to the original brightness of a Game Boy or turn it back on during the nighttime, which was really amazing at the time. And everybody loved it because you could easily just pop in a game, flip it open, play the game in the dark, done, you turn it off, flip it, put it in your pocket, just like that. And the actual size of this is around, say, like one Game Boy game and a Game Boy Advance game, I'd say. About that, a Game Boy and a Game Boy Advance game combined is about the width and height of the Game Boy Advance SP. And I really love this thing. The buttons are okay. They're not as good as the Game Boy Advance originals, but they're not bad. They're still pretty quiet, but not as quiet as the Game Boy Advances, as I've been saying. And, yeah, it was just really convenient at the time when this released that, oh, it's only $30 more, and you get a foldable screen that protects it in case of, like, you have a child or something that wants a Game Boy. So then if they drop it like this, then it won't mess up the screen, or if they get anything on it or have stuff in their pockets with it, it won't mess up the screen, which I'm guessing that's what happened because of the stuff like this, all the scratches and stuff before I bought it. But it was really convenient to have a flip screen, a light that can be turned on and off on it, and you don't need nothing else. And also the thing is, this was the first ever Game Boy to have a rechargeable battery, which was insane at the time. No more wasting money for batteries. That was a good thing and a bad thing for some people, because in case if you ever went on road trips and this thing died on you and you didn't have a charger for it, it's game over. But with the other Game Boys, if they died on you, you just need 2 or 4 AA batteries and you're back into the gameplay just like that. But this had some drawbacks and stuff, as I just named or told y'all. But yeah, it still had the port for the core to trade Pokemon and stuff in games. And it was just a really popular Game Boy. The only one of the only things is that you needed an adapter to have a aux cord. Yes, Apple was not the first to actually do that. Nintendo was. Originally with the Game Boy Advance, as you could see down here, there's a port to plug in headphones to listen to, in case if you were watching a movie or show on here, or if you were wanting to listen to your game. And yes, they did have shows for the Game Boy Advance. They had what was called a video cartridge, and they had different kinds of Cartoon Network shows, Nickelodeon shows, and my favorite, Pokemon shows. They had actually full episodes of the Pokemon series, and one cart had 2 episodes, full episodes of the Pokemon series. And it was really good. But yeah, you would buy an adapter that went into here, and it would have a aux cord where you could plug in your headphones into and listen to the show or what you were listening to. Also, if you were watching a show, instead of having to prop this one up on something because it has nothing, this one you could just stand up and have it like this, bent halfway, so then it could be stood up and you could watch your show, or like this if you're way above it and towering it. Because, you know, there's some tall people in this world. I'm not one of them. 5'4". Sure, but we don't talk about that. But yeah, if you wanted to watch shows on this, it'd probably be one of the best ones because you could just stand it up like this and have it like that. But yeah, also one of the cool things about this is if you were playing a game and you didn't want to save it and waste time doing that, you could easily, like say, for instance, say if it's the last day of school and you're playing this during your classes and you still got to swap through the classes, but you're not not doing any work and you want to play this. Only I would want to do that, but you could easily be playing like Pokemon or Mario, and as soon as you get done with the level or the battle, or if you're in the middle of a battle and you got to switch, just flip it shut. It'll completely shut off the system, but it won't turn anything off. Let me just show y'all. If I'm right here, let's get it to the Mario game. As you can see, we are playing Mario. And say if I'm switching classes, boom, you could see it's still on, as you could see. But as soon as I want to get back into the action, boom, I'm right back, as you could see. So it's pretty convenient, I would say. If like you were watching a show and need to pause it and don't want to turn it off and lose your progress on the show or movie, and if you're playing a game, you don't want to lose your progress, that's pretty convenient. But it's the only one that can do that. And also, a fact about this specific Game Boy, this one right here, Nintendo actually had the idea of the 3DS back in 2002. So it was released in 2011, but they had the idea with this right here, and they were trying to do it. But the quality turned out to be terrible. But if it wasn't terrible, then they would have released it 2002. But anyways, so the last one that we have here is known as the failure of Nintendo, released in 2005, the Game Boy Micro. This little tiny thing, I got this at a Game Exchange, which is a retro game store. I got it from a Game Exchange near me for $200. I think, I'm not sure, I think either this one or the Game Boy Light is the one I've spent the most money on, because I have it back here, the Game Boy Light. The Game Boy Light's actually Japan exclusive, and the reason why is because, let me show you. It was released in 1998, a few months before the Game Boy Color, and this one not supposed to be part of the video, but the Game Boy Light was actually the first Game Boy to ever have light inside of the Game Boy. So it was Japan exclusive, not in America. That's with the light off. That's with the light off. That's with the light on. It was pretty good brightness, but it was still like a kind of teal colorway, which is not bad, but it's not the best. It's not as bright though. It's around the same brightness, but not as bright as the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance probably seems brighter because of the colored screen. But who knows? But yeah, 1998 Japan exclusive Game Boy Light was it's pretty rare. Sort of. Not as rare as the Game Boy Micro though. The Game Boy Micro only sold 2 million units, which is why it's known as Nintendo's failure. It was released in 2005, which was a few months after the DS was released. And the Nintendo DS was known as the successor to the Nintendo Game Boy Advance at the time. So basically, everybody thought they're going to stop doing Game Boy Advance and start working on DS. Or they're going to do a few more Game Boy Advance titles since the DS could play Game Boy Advance. But no, Nintendo decided to throw a curveball at everybody, like we were in an MLB game, and released this, Nintendo's failure, or the actual name, Game Boy Micro. It was known for its small shape and portability, and especially the small screen. Everybody complained the screen is way too small, made them cross-eyed, or made them squint way too much, and it made their eyes hurt. But the thing is that made mostly everybody not like this system is that it can only play Game Boy Advance games. Heard that right? Only Game Boy Advance games. The thing is, even Nintendo said it had everything that it needed to play Game Boy games, but the only thing that they didn't have was the actual chip in it to connect it and keep the game inside. It can play Game Boy games perfectly, but the thing is, it don't hold it in. And what I mean by play them perfectly, I mean, it has the hardware to do it. It just don't have the chip to keep it in. So it just falls out instead of a Game Boy Advance game that stays in there. Whenever I first got this thing, this is how bright the screen was. I thought this was the brightest it ever went. Boy, was I wrong. The screen goes much brighter. It goes all the way to this brightness, which is really bright, but it's pretty bright. As you can see how bright it is. The thing is about this is that the lowest brightness is still brighter than the AGS001 on the GBA SP. But the highest brightness is also brighter than the 101 Game Boy SP. And everybody was hating on the system, saying, oh, screen was too small, it only played Game Boy Advance games, there's nothing good to do with it, it's a stupid collector's item. Me, it's my favorite Game Boy Advance, honestly. Because with the Game Boy Advance, it don't feel right to play original Game Boy games with the Game Boy Advance, because it has a specific purpose for the library of Game Boy Advance games. The whole reason of the original Game Boys, in my opinion, was to play original Game Boy games. That's why there's no other games that the Game Boys can play. Even though there was nothing to begin with that was before the Game Boy, but still, you get the point. I have a thing where if say say if the PS4 could play PS3 games, I would probably rarely play PS3 games, but in my opinion, it would be a thing for only PS4 games, because it's a PS4, so it's meant for PS4 games. That's the same thing I have here, where a Game Boy Advance is for Game Boy Advance games. So whenever I heard about this and I found it at a game exchange and I found out they were rare, I went ahead and picked it up for $200. And I didn't regret it, honestly. I did a little bit when I found out I couldn't play Game Boy games, because the only game I had with me until I got home 2 hours later was Pokemon Blue on the original Game Boy. But that's about it. And as soon as I got home and I got my Game Boy Advance games, I was pretty happy. I love this thing, honestly. Literally, I could be in the middle of class, sneakily playing this behind a book, and then I have to hurry up and leave. slip it in my pocket easily. Boom, it's in my pocket. The small form factor. Walk to class, sit down, take it out, put it behind a book, and easily play it. It's really small. It's a really small Game Boy. So small, in fact, that it's about 1.5 Game Boy Advance games in length. And in height, it's less than it's about one Game Boy Advance game in height. It's about the size of a Game Boy Advance game. It's just a little bit bigger than a Game Boy Advance game, so it can actually play it. They decided to go back with the headphone jack, though, as you could see. That's pretty good, as always. Specific thing about the system is that when you turn it on, these two are blue down here. The start and select buttons are blue, which means that they're at good battery. But whenever they go to bad battery, they'll be red and they'll stay on the whole time you're playing. But that's how you know if it's low battery. As soon as it turns to red, you might want to get a charger. But if not, then you might want to keep your playing time very, very, like, kind of slow and rare during the day until you can get a charger. The thing is about the Game Boy Micro is that whenever it's low battery, it tends to go through the Game Boy Advance loading screen and then shut off. Or randomly shut off during the game you're playing, which I found weird, but apparently it's something to do with the battery. Because it's low battery, it's letting you know that you need to charge it. So I thought that was weird. But actually right now, with the Game Boy Micro, I'm doing a little challenge that I'm going to post a video of on April. I'm doing a 30-day Game Boy challenge. Game Boy Advance games. I can only play Game Boy Advance games for 30 days. And the two systems I'm using are the Game Boy Advance SP and the Micro. But I'm mostly using the Micro since it's my favorite. And yeah, only Game Boy Advance games. So let's see how long it takes me to go insane. But yeah, I love this little guy. I love it. When people say it's too small, screen's too small, even though the screen is literally the size of, let me see if I can find something in my room. Like quite literally the length of a debit card. The length of a debit card is what this is. But I don't think that's too small for a gaming system, honestly. I think it's just right. It's pretty comfortable. I hold my system like this, and if not, then I hold it like this. And it's rare if I hold it like this. But it's pretty comfortable because of the size of my hands. I hold it like this, and I play it. And if my hands do start to cramp up and get, like, start hurting to where I need to stretch them, it's only about after 3.5 hours of gameplay. 3 hours, 3.5 hours of gameplay. Which most people say they can get 30 minutes of playing with this without it hurting their hands. But for me, it's my favorite Game Boy Advance. Not favorite Game Boy Advance. Because if I was only able to choose one Game Boy Advance, it'd be between these two. And most likely, if it was for, like, whichever Game Boy Advance I got, that's the only Game Boy I could ever have, then I would choose this one because it could play original ones. But if it was just for Game Boy Advance and I'd still have an original Game Boy, I would get this. But if you really don't care about the screen and you want to play Game Boy Advance games and original games, get the original Game Boy Advance. But if you do want to have a good light on your screen, have a light, a rechargeable battery, and be able to protect the screen with a flip cover and play Game Boy Advance and original games, get the Advance SP because it's the most favorited Game Boy Advance. Or if you just want to play Game Boy Advance games and have a good brightness screen with a good battery life, then get the Game Boy Micro. But my favorite Game Boy Advance is the Micro Tell me what y'all think y'all's is in the comments below. Comments, I'm not sure if they will work. They normally don't work, but I'll try to get it fixed. But hopefully you guys enjoyed. Make sure to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. And as always, I'll be right back in the next one. I'm out. Peace.